Hello, my name is Megs Reynolds, and I'm the Executive Director for the Do More Agriculture Foundation. We are the national voice and champion for mental health in Canadian agriculture, and this is another edition of our Talk It Out series. This month we are focusing on ADHD. Joining me today is Himadry Singh. Himadry, thank you so much for coming on and having a conversation, and I will let you further introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me. My name's Himadry, and I actually work as a marketing manager for Do More Egg. I live with ADHD.
I guess let's start there of like how would you describe your experience of ADHD to somebody else?
Yeah. So for those that don't know, ADHD means attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And it definitely shows differently in everyone. There's differences even between like men and women and how it can show up. For me, it's a variety of things, obviously attention being one. So just like focus on a daily task, but then there's also other ones like impulse behavior. So that sometimes shows up to me is irresponsible financial decisions. Like if I'm shopping, I can get obsessed with an item until I get it, and it feels like you can't not think of it. So in the past, I've had to learn new behavior methods for that. Emotional regulation is a hard one with ADHD. So that's oftentimes why we get labeled as like too sensitive or like too emotional in reactions. And then the other like little things I've noticed is just like attention to details is sometimes hard. So, like if I'm doing like a mundane task, sometimes that comes up. But yeah, there's a lot of different symptoms like frustration, fatigue, because even though my body's hyperactive, my mind can't rest. So I'll feel fatigue, but I have energy to do things. It's like, it's weird that it's contradicting. And then suicidal thoughts is actually something that a lot of people with ADHD face. I think I read a study recently that said that those with ADHD are higher risk of suicide. So yeah, a lot combined in there. There's some good and bad with it too, of course.
hmm Where can you walk us through a little bit of like what the diagnosis process was like for you and when you found out? I know I remember being in school and there were some kids that were, diagnosed at an earlier age, and I think now we're hearing a lot about later in life diagnosis, especially with women. So if you can share kind of your journey on that side.
Yeah, it actually was not an easy process. I think anything when it comes to mental health, it's so hard to diagnose, but I struggled with it as a teenager. I always had depressive episodes, and I was always told that like you must be PMSing, like you'll grow out of it. I didn't grow out of it. University came, and it wasn't that I was like struggling with studying and that, but I noticed like little things coming, like sitting in the lecture, like I would have to like doodle, like I couldn't focus, and I would get so frustrated with myself. And so it wasn't until I was 26 or 27 that someone very close to me was like, hey, like, I think you might have this. And at the same time, I just had a close friend be diagnosed with it. So when she was sharing symptoms, I remember listening to it and be like, that sounds like very familiar. Like, I thought that's just how we were. um, and so he actually encouraged me to go see a doctor. And the first doctor I went to, because I didn't want to go to my family doctor because it was related to my family. Like I wanted this to be kept a secret until I knew what was going on. So the first doctor I went to, she told me that she only worked on women's health, so this wasn't included. So that was frustrating. So then the person I had talked to encouraged me to go again. They knew a lot about like the mental health realm, so I went again, and then that person, and like I did my test online. Like when I was told this, it wasn't like I just booked an appointment. Like I had done my research. There's online tests that you can do. Did some of those, went to her, and then she tried to diagnose it with depression, anxiety. But because I had already been diagnosed with it, I let her know like this doesn't feel like that. Like this feels more. And so eventually I got to see a specialist, and I remember sitting there and he started asking these questions. It's like, "Oh, do you often like have an impulse reaction to like interrupt people or like have a time?" And it was just like, "Yes, yes, yes." Like it was the first time someone had like validated what I was going through, because this whole time I was like, "I'm just like I must be struggling." But yeah, so it took a little bit of advocating.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to highlight too, that you have to advocate. And it may not just be as easy as showing up to that first person you try to figure that out with, or, doctor. There might be more of a process, and that I think especially now post-pandemic with the way our healthcare systems are, that you really need to be conscious of possibly having to push for what you need, especially if you strongly feel that that might be something that you're experiencing.
Yeah, and I feel like it's ADHD has also been like a trending word. So a lot of times people I don't even just like friends and stuff don't necessarily understand what it is. I didn't either until like I started diving in. So it's kind of something to easy sometimes like brush off as well.
Mhm. And I think too, we've touched on this before, but in other conversations of, our first, when someone starts talking about it, and it might not just be ADHD, it could be something else, but we're quick to be like, oh, I do that.
Hmm.
And do you want to maybe comment on how that can make you feel, or could make somebody else feel, where it's just like me over here saying like, oh, I have that,
Yeah.
versus like someone who actually has that diagnosis and lives with that daily?
Yeah. So when I first started being more open about it, that was definitely a comment I would get. Like I would get, oh, like I have it too. Just like the same way, like with OCD, a lot of people be like, oh, I have to leave the house clean. I must be OCD. That's not true. People who live with OCD, they like physically can't, um, like do things without like finishing a task, and it's different. So it just diminishes what you're going through and what you're feeling, and it's discouraging to go for help. I remember I was in a group of friends and I had just been diagnosed. I wasn't even like as deciding whether I even wanted to do the medication because it takes a little bit of an acceptance period. And I remember him, and he worked in the health profession, being like, oh, like ADHD, it's like a scale, like everybody has it. And it's like, that's not true. So yeah, being careful with your words, or just even sometimes you get told like, oh, you're just lazy, because procrastination is often a big symptom. And the thing that individuals don't realize is like procrastination comes because we're so overstimulated. Like if I'm trying to do a task, but there's 1,000 things around me, like if my desk is messy or something, I just can't do it. And then I feel overwhelmed, and then I can't do it. And then you like feel bad because you can't like you feel like a disappointment, and then you go into like this spiral because the next day that like overwhelms you. It's just, yeah, it is. Sometimes you have to be careful with your words.
Mhm. And what you just talked about made me think of a video that I saw on social media of a mental health professional who diagnoses and works with children with ADHD. And he uses this race car analogy and says, you have this amazing Ferrari engine of a brain, but you have bicycle brakes on it. And it's learning how to use the brake system and putting new brake system on so that you can harness what is there and the positive that is there. And I think, what you just said speaks really to that, right? Where there's all those moving pieces, and that one, how that's what's going on can make it so much harder to focus, which then makes you feel like you can't start the thing. And then you have, like you said, the feelings of crap, I should have started this and I haven't, and being overwhelmed, and
Hmm.
kind of that whole series of events that not everybody has, that sitting down to respond to an email or to finish a report they were working on.
Yeah, I know. And like learning the tools too, just how do you self maintain yourself in order to do that, like especially in different environments. But yeah, like you mentioned, there are positives to it. Like one thing with ADHD is we often are creative people. And so that comes with we just have a different perspective because our brains are just wired a little bit different. But like even like the whole like we focus on so many different things, it also helps me multitask. Like I've talked about how contradicting some of these sentences are. It's like I can multitask at times, but like might not be all tasks. And then sometimes I can get hyper focused, which is sometimes a benefit versus that. But again, it's yeah, learning how to do that in that car.
What have been some of the tools and mechanisms that you've developed that have worked for yourself?
Um, so I've created more of like a toolkit for me. It would be like my medication that I take. I started therapy right away, so and I went kind of in and out with it, but I learned just different tactics through that, or just being more aware of my behavior and how do I regulate my emotions, or if I'm in a conversation, how do I learn to like stay focused, or And then on top of that, I did a lot of research, just whether that was on Google or for me, I do therapy online on BetterHelp. So they actually have little support groups. And that was kind of helpful because I could like jump in and be like, oh, someone else has the same thing. Like, that's cool. Like, what did you do? And then the biggest thing for me was communication. It was sharing it with people around me. So now I have friends, like if I go through like a depressive episode, they know kind of the signs and symptoms to look for in me and they check me sometimes because you don't know it. Like when you have
Mhm.
a great cloud on you, you have no idea like that it's there. So to have someone check in and have that helps. And then yeah, just like sharing and being open helps me create boundaries with someone as well as them understanding where I'm coming from. And also them setting boundaries with me too. Like
Right.
time management is a big one with ADHD. So it's like for some people, it's like showing up late. For me, it's like if I have a meeting at 4, like I'm probably prepping from like 10 a.m. and just being like, I have to be on this, I have to be on this. So just like learning your behavior goes a long way too.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And like you touched on earlier, everyone is going to be different in what maybe works for them, what they're experiencing, what symptoms and that they have. What Here's a good question, especially considering that we work together. What are things that people can do, whether that's friends, family, colleagues, or even uh, work environments to better support someone with ADHD?
Yeah. Um, there's definitely like the sport aspect of like being able to talk and being open and validating. With work environment, the biggest one for me is work meetings. It's considered rude to be like doodling on your paper. Like people take that as me being bored, but it's actually the opposite. When I'm like, if I doodle a whole page, your conversation must have been great because I was focused the whole time. So like, because like when I'm able to do something kind of mundane with my mind, it helps me focus on something else. At my last job, they actually used to let us walk around during meetings. And like, I know that sounds kind of wild, but like we would be in a meeting and it was the first time that I experienced it. And I remember being super shy about it because it's like, oh, I can just like get up and stretch, but I'm still listening to the person and it was more comfortable and we could share more ideas. So those were like little things that you can do. I think the biggest thing too is just learning about ADHD because again, like it gets put into this category that it's like just you can't focus, you're lazy, like just sit down. That verbiage doesn't help. Like trust me, we have tried. It's just understanding like okay, if you're doing this, like what's something else we can try. Um and yeah, and like a good one is like time management. It's like if someone else is coming late, maybe like figure out a way that like that cat doesn't bother you. Like maybe they need to go on their own to an event, or if you're someone that like needs to be early, then like maybe you need to learn how to just go on your own and be there as well.
Hmm. I was working with yeah, I like the point on time management. Like I was working with a group of tech founders in agriculture and ran a mental health thing with them, and was speaking to one of the individuals afterwards, and he was saying that he had actually had been pulled aside and had a private conversation with one of the organizers of the week-long event, and their comment had been like, we need to see you put more effort into being on time. And he didn't even realize that he had been late. And he said, well, how late have I been? And they had it kind of marked in their head. And I think it was like 5 or 7 minutes ish for most things. And he's like, that for me is really good. Right. And he's like, and
Yeah,
he told them, he's like, that for me is, I'm doing really well if that's, how late I am. But
yeah,
to your point of like, you have to be open with that communication, because otherwise you have that person possibly that could be work or a friend or whoever that's frustrated and they're not expressing that. And then without having the other side of the communication, they're also not understanding that for you or for that person, maybe that's a win, right?
yeah. Well, and exactly, like, I think open communication is important on both ends, like, but, like, just because I have ADHD doesn't mean that my behavior is, like, inexcusable, so, like, I've had to have people have had conversations of, like, "This is something that bothers me," and it's like, then I know what I can fix on or like what I can work on. I will say it, like part of the diagnosis is sometimes you hear all these like bad habits, and it's part of the acceptance too of when you get diagnosed. It's like I remember being like, okay, a relief, like, I know what's going on. And then I almost went through like denial before it. And then I went through this weird acceptance of like, this is who I am. Like, just deal with it before I could be like, before I got into therapy and became self aware. And I was like, okay, this is what I can do. And this creates a stronger relationship with the people I love and people I work with as well.
Hmm. Yeah, you can't just say like, "Hey, I'm just someone that's a jerk, so sorry for being mean to you," right? Like there
Yeah.
has to be ownership on both sides.
Yeah, exactly.
What are some of the uh, misconceptions or stereotypes that you feel exist out there that we see a lot maybe on social media or that we have just in our brains maybe from what we knew about it growing up? I can think of, your comment of that interrupting. Often I think it was more younger boys that were diagnosed in school, and they were the ones that were kind of that class clown or the ones that were,
Mhm.
causing disruptions in class. And so for me, I kind of have that in my brain. But what kind of do you see out there as those misconceptions or stereotypes? And then what can we do maybe as advocates to try to break some of that down once we learn that that's not true?
Yeah. Um, I think I touched on it a couple like before, like with the whole like laziness, like, like that's not what we are trying to do. It's like imagine you're on a race with someone else, but then there's this brick wall in front of you. Like it's hard to like run when there's something like that. And then the emotional and too sensitive, like I think that gets missed. Like if you don't know that someone has it or that understanding, like it can get, yeah, I don't know. That's one thing that I've heard a lot is like the too emotional and too sensitive. And that can be pretty hurtful.
And is that
But
more put on women, do you feel?
I do because I do think ADHD shows differently between the two. I believe that's why women get misdiagnosed for so long. Like there are other women I've spoke to who like it's normal for them to be told that they have depression or like to blame it on our menstrual cycle. It's like it's not. You can't blame it on that. And I think it shows up like I said, it's different with everyone, and you kind of have to dive into the deeper questions. Like as a kid, like I wasn't blurting out in class because I was a shy kid, and so it never got recognized.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I think in order to break it, I think just having conversations like these help, where it's just understanding what it is, and being open to what someone is telling you with the experience. I think and it has to do with like being misdiagnosed so long and like finally getting it. It is frustrating when I like try to share it to someone. It's like this is it, and then people diminish that with like that's just normal. And I think that's a barrier in a lot of mental illnesses where people's initial thoughts and when someone's getting help, like when I finally went to therapy, it was because I was put in a crisis situation and I needed help. But like if I, in that moment, had someone to like diminish my feelings, I probably would not have ever gone, or I wouldn't have gone back so many times either.
Hmm. And I know we've talked about this lots, but it is challenging and sometimes unfortunate how we've as in the greater we have chosen to use the same words for feelings as we have for diagnosable illness. So,
Mhm.
I can be feeling depressed without having depression. And
Yeah,
that can be confusing and blur the lines or diminish what someone is going through or feeling, because we can try
yeah,
to use those words or we can relate to those feelings.
yeah,
Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where we're at.
yeah. And then that also brings like being an active listener and like listening to actually understand because there's a lot of times where like you start sharing something and again it's you become hesitant into sharing. Like it is a big feeling to be like told that you have something. But sometimes I'll tell a story and then someone else will jump in and be like, well, I have that, blah, blah. And then they talk about, they put themselves versus listening to what's going on and then responding. So I think active listening plays a huge role too.
And that is so important for all aspects of life, but especially supporting someone that you do know is struggling with something. Being able to actively listen to validate what they're saying because it's about them, not about you or what you've experienced or how you would feel. And then that empathy piece, and not looking to fix it right away, but just looking to understand and support.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
How has the whole process of living with ADHD prior to knowing that that's for sure what was going on, to being diagnosed, to where you are now with being so much more self-aware and having all the different tools in your toolbox to support you with that, how has that affected relationships, either with friends or family, maybe even family specifically?
Um, it's been a roller coaster ride. Like, I mean, internally, you're going through all these emotions. It can be frustrating to take medication all the time. I do not recommend this to anyone unless you talk to a mental health professional. But there's times where I just stop taking my medication because I'm feeling really good. And then, like, well, I don't need this. I can self manage. And then all of a sudden, like, my mental health is deteriorating, and the people that like have to deal with it is obviously family. I think my brother probably gets a brunt of it, the amount of times I've, like, just, like, everything's fine, and then I'll wake up one day and I'm just, like, in tears, like, I don't know how to regulate my emotions. Once I became more acceptable and I learned how things affected me, like, even with medication, I had to go through different dosages, and I went through different side effects before I found the right one. Um, and then even with therapy, like I went to a couple of therapists before I found something that worked for me. But once I became more aware of what I needed and I knew my signs, my cycles went down. So it's not like I'm never going to have a depressive episode or struggle with an everyday thing, but I was better able to jump back in. And I noticed that a lot this year where I had a episode, I'd say, like earlier in spring, early summer. The way that I came back was a lot different than something I like similarly experienced like a few years before I was even diagnosed. Back then, that would have taken me out for 6 months where I wouldn't want to, and then this one was like a month or two. So just even seeing that difference in my journal was like, oh, like it helps.
Mhm. Okay, so journal, that's not been something you've mentioned. So that's a tool that's been helpful for you.
Yeah, I've always liked writing, and I always liked writing, and part of that was just because I didn't want to be too emotional, so I would like put it all down, and then it actually helps me communicate with people because I've written it all down before I go up to them, and I have like, this is what I want to talk about, and this is why.
Some time to process before engaging.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Highly
Um,
recommend it over an angry text, which is
yes.
often what ADHD does with impulse text. Yeah, way better.
Yeah. You go from reacting to responding. That's a much
Yeah.
better place to try to be, I'd say, for any type of communication. And I also want to highlight something that you just talked about too, where there was a process of finding the right medication, finding the right dose, and there was a process also to finding the right therapist. And just so, anyone out there who's listening, I know that we can all want that like quick fix, and it can be really discouraging when we're not able to have that. But to give yourself grace and space for it to be a process. And I've heard, especially on the therapist side, people kind of joke about finding a therapist like online dating, where you don't just, the first person you swipe right on, but that's it, you're
Mhm.
done. And so to make sure you find someone that you're really comfortable with and it's a good fit for you. And maybe, as life goes on and things change and where you're at changes, maybe that means finding someone else as well, who's going to better support you in that stage of where you're at.
Yeah, exactly. And you can ask your therapist questions too, something that I've learned, like especially if you like if there's specific things you want to work with. And therapy doesn't always have to be forever. I've had a therapist, I remember feeling like a breakup. I was like so like, why are you leaving me? But my therapist was like, oh, you're like at a stage, like we've completed the goals we set. And she's like, yeah, we can, and we slowly like started doing calls less and less, but and you can always come back to it too. And I think people forget that, like it's there for when you need it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think sometimes that's a barrier too, where people are like, I'm not going to start therapy because then I never get out of therapy.
Yeah,
And sure, there are people that, yeah, you
yeah,
can go in and out, or maybe it is more focused on that one thing, and then, but you're not locked into it for life just because you've reached
yeah.
out at one point.
It's a built-in friendship that you pay for, that they sit and listen and give you advice. It's amazing. I did not think that when I started it, and I was like, "What are they gonna say? Lay me down in a chair and like tell me how I feel?" Like, no, thank you. But yeah,
How do you feel about that?
yeah, it's definitely not what you see on TV.
I know one of the things we've talked about before, and I think it's maybe part of that, the risk or the impulse piece, but finances. I think that was something that you wanted to touch on today, was kind of how that can play into ADHD.
Yeah, it's often that was one of the like aha moments I had when I was like talking to a professional was I was irresponsible with my shopping, like I mentioned. Like I saw something, I wanted it, and you can go into debt pretty quick with that. And without like someone checking in or like having support that way, you can get lost in it. And that's a big part of that is that impulse piece that's in our brain that we see something, we want it. Like I love short-term gratification. It's not great long term, but it's what happens. And so financially, that was another thing that came out of my like process of having to be open and talk about that. And it's not an easy one to speak of, but with anyone with ADHD, if that is something that you feel like it is beneficial to talk to the people around you and have someone that holds you accountable. Like I have that now. I need that. I realize that that's part of my toolkit of having someone like check in with me on that.
Yeah, and there's professionals that you can get help with all of that, right? Whether it's help setting up a budget or staying on
Yeah.
budget. And
Yeah.
yeah,
But the thing is too with ADHD, because you procrastinate, we often procrastinate the things that we don't like to do. So like it becomes hard because you like don't want to disappoint the person, but it'll yeah. And then like a self-maintenance for me, and this sounds weird, but doing my taxes, like it stresses me out. But like when I finally sit and get it done, like I think of that as self-care to me.
that's great. I like that. And that's important, that self-care, self-maintenance piece is what works for you. It's not going to
Yeah.
be the same for everybody. What advice would you give to someone else that is maybe thinking that they might have ADHD, or what do you wish you would have? What would you say to yourself, like if you could go back in time to kind of support you in like going through the process of like, okay, I think something's here. I'm gonna get diagnosed or go start that
Yeah.
process.
With my experience, definitely that. Like, if you feel like you have something, definitely advocate for yourself. I know it's not always easy, and just because the first one doesn't work out doesn't mean you can't go again. Like, it took me a little bit to find the courage to, and then you aren't what you're diagnosed. I'm someone that lives with ADHD. I'm not my ADHD. So even though there's like the stigma of it, like in a workplace, you might not want to share it because it's like I'm not lazy and like I can look at like details and things like that, but there's all the stigma and of course it shows up differently with everyone. But just knowing like this is something I live with and that's okay and that there's tools to help me get through it.
Mhm. Were there any aha moments that you've had since your diagnosis that where pieces kind of fell in, where you're like, oh, this is why that happens, or why I do this, or
Yeah.
how to support myself with that?
I feel like TikTok's been a really good source of getting me it's like, is it my personality or is it my ADHD? Like, I don't know anymore. I think the shopping one was the biggest. Like, I didn't really understand why I struggled so much with it. And then I remember being in the doctor's office and he's like, yeah, like that's a big piece of like people with ADHD. And I was like, huh, like some of these tendencies that I've struggled so long with don't actually have to be that.
Mhm. Is there anything else you'd love to highlight or share that we haven't touched on so far for either someone like yourself who is living with, or someone who's supporting, or even just good for anyone to know, because we're going to come into, contact and, whether it's a friend, family member, colleague, what have you, with someone living with ADHD.
Yeah. I think I covered everything. Like, I think the biggest piece is that open communication. Like, as the person going through it, like, be open, talk to about what you need or what's going on in your mind because it helps other people understand you, but it also opens the door to have discussions of what might be going on. And then also, people don't know what you need unless you communicate it. I can't expect that from someone. And then as a supporter, just being able to also listen, and it's a lot of patience, I would say. Like, you know, getting blurts out in a sentence or not getting a word in can be frustrating, I imagine. So just understanding and creating and communicating those needs.
Those are great. And you mentioned BetterHelp. For anyone that doesn't know what that is, BetterHelp is a app where you can connect to therapists and, like you said, other support groups. We also have Ag Talk, which is a peer-to-peer support platform for anyone connected to agriculture. You can, connect on farming things in there, or you could connect with other people who are living with ADHD as well. And you can connect to Ag Talk through our website, which is domore.ag/ag talk. For anyone looking to learn more about mental health in agriculture, we've got, endless lists of resources, either to connect with on our website or wellness tips. You can also go to our website to donate if you're looking to support the work that we do. Himadry, thank you so much for everything you shared today and everything you do with the foundation.